Is it useful to have a term called false suicide? In order to understand this, think about any time we bring up the male suicide rate. The immediate conversation always happens, well, women attempt it more often. And the prevailing wisdom of our culture is that men commit suicide more often because they choose more lethal methods and because they don't seek psychological help. And of course, you can continue with this back and forth. It's very predictable. You argue that the psychological community and therapy is very feminized. It's very much geared towards treating things in a way that appeals to women. And Tom Golden, of course, is, I think, a pretty good authority on this matter. I think the way he treats this issue is something that I definitely can replicate. So I would just defer to him rather than reinventing the wheel. But then in regard to the notion that, well, men are just choosing more lethal methods, of course, the implication is that women are either stupid, like they don't understand that they're choosing methods that are not going to be effective, or they don't really want to kill themselves. Now, I kind of want to back the conversation up a little bit, because once you start entertaining this idea that attempted suicide and actual committed suicide are comparable, what happens in a lot of people's mind is they're tricked into thinking that one suicide attempt is sort of more or less equivalent to an actual completed suicide. Because the notion, of course, that the argument is that suicide is overwhelmingly a men's issue by a ridiculous margin. This is not a 60-40 thing. It's like an 80-20 thing. It's ridiculously lopsidedly, clearly a men's issue. But when you allow someone to say, oh, but women attempt it more often, it tricks normal people into thinking that there's some sort of gender parity in suicide. Now, there's so many reasons that this is wrong, though. Imagine a person who, quote-unquote, attempts suicide a dozen times. Well, that person is now counted a dozen times relative to a person who, you can only kill yourself one time. So, now, I don't know exactly the degree to which the degree to which that actually affects things. But the point is that we shouldn't allow for this one-to-one comparison, and I believe that coining the phrase fake suicide or false suicide is pretty useful. Now, I understand it's insensitive, it's a little bit dismissive, because obviously a person attempting suicide, obviously they have some sort of problem. Even if they're just doing it for attention, well, certainly there's something going on there, and I don't want to entirely dismiss that. But I suppose I've revealed I kind of do want to partially dismiss it, because it's being used as a tactic to dismiss actual committed suicide. Now, the way to understand this, I think, is to look at rape. So feminists expand the definition of rape. They count everything as rape. They count everything as sexual violence, and they use this to inflate the statistics. Well, by including attempted suicide in the overall conversation of suicide, they're essentially inflating suicide, right? Think of attempted suicide as sexual assault and committed suicide as rape. Well, if you want to actually address rape, having a whole bunch of things that are considered sexual assault that really have nothing to do with rape muddy up the conversation isn't helpful. And I think that there's a similar dynamic when it comes to false suicide. The other aspect of it has to do with what is called the desperate corner. And this is basically that you have a lot of people who are primarily drug addicts, and they end up committing suicide, but unintentionally, because they overdose on drugs. Now, these could be counted as suicide attempts, right? So that's another part of the conversation that muddies it up even further. And my point is that using the term false suicide allows us to have a little bit more clarity in regard to this issue. The other thing, too, is it's a little bit more realistic. Very often, people who are attempting suicide, I think that you can logically deduce that their number one motive is not to kill themselves. If their number one motive were to kill themselves, they would have succeeded. They obviously had ulterior motives, and I don't think that it does anyone any service to deny that these ulterior motives are in play. Certainly, it can be a little bit insensitive. I'm perfectly willing to grant that. But at the same time, if we're honestly dealing with these issues, that's going to involve a little bit of insensitivity, just as calling out false rape accusations involves a little bit of sensitivity. You know, the false rape accuser doesn't like being exposed as a false accuser. And as John the Other had pointed out in a recent video, a lot of these people legitimately believe they were assaulted or raped because of this feminist narrative, because of this quote-unquote consciousness raising, right? So I think the parallels are stunning, and that's why I think we need to have a term called false suicide. Thanks for listening.